April 21st would be a busy day along the Western Front, and by the time von Richthofen took to the air, British machines were already engaged in their work, taking reconnaissance photos and directing the artillery fire for their batteries on the ground. At the same time the Jasta 11 pilots were climbing into the air, a squadron of Sopwith Camels was taking off from its base at Bertangles, 20 miles away. Until recently, this squadron had been designated Royal Naval No. 9, but had since been absorbed into the new Royal Air Force as No. 209 Squadron. 209 would be flying at full strength today, performing a high offensive patrol broken into 3 sections. A flight was led by Captain Roy Brown, a native of Calleton Place, Ontario. Brown had been in action since early 1917, and by now had 11 victories under his belt. Recent months in combat, however, had left Brown both physically and mentally fatigued, and only a few days earlier he had been urged by his friend Ray Collishaw, the great Sopwith triplane ace, to add himself to the sick roll and have himself removed from duty. To Collishaw, Brown appeared on the verge of a nervous breakdown as he obsessed over the welfare of the men he was leading in battle. The newest member of 209 Squadron and A Flight was Wilfred May, a school chum of Brown's from back in Ontario. The arrival of May had undoubtedly increased the level of Roy Brown's stress, and on the morning of the 21st he had urged the neophyte to stick close to his leader and avoid getting into any single combats with the seasoned German flyers they would probably be encountering. As von Richthofen and his flyers approached the front, they were joined by a group of albatrosses belonging to Jasta 5, and within minutes had spotted the dozen Sopwith Camels of No. 209 Squadron. The German pilots didn't have to wait for the Baron's signal to attack, and immediately found themselves twisting and zooming in a large dogfight, slowly drifting towards the British lines. Following Brown's instructions, Wilfred May hovered on the fringes of the free-for-all, until a Fokker crossed in front of his Sopwith, and May, giving in to temptation, briefly pursued it and fired off a few shots. It was then that he saw the all-red triplane that had come up behind his tail, and remembering his old chum's advice, dropped his nose and opened his throttle towards the British lines. Whether Manfred Von Richthofen had become disoriented about the direction in which he was traveling, or for once had thrown caution to the wind, will never be known. But the fact remains that on this occasion, von Richthofen committed one of his rare mistakes by giving chase to the Camel. As May sped west along the Somme River Valley, weaving to and fro to avoid the Baron's guns, von Richthofen concentrated on what he was sure would be his 81st victory. Roy Brown had seen May dive away from the dogfight pursued by the red triplane and had torn after them from above. As the planes raced down the Somme, the chase was witnessed by hundreds of troops on the ground, including several groups of Australian machine gunners who fired as the Baron passed. Brown had also managed to fire at von Richthofen, and after passing Morlancourt Ridge, the triplane seemed to briefly stagger before performing a sideslip and falling in a steep glide that brought it crashing to the ground on its nose. In the cockpit, Manfred von Richthofen sat dead, a single bullet having passed through his chest. Within minutes, the crash site was swarming with British and Australian troops, many who had witnessed the dramatic last flight of the Red Baron. Of course, everybody at the front knew about the famous red triplane, and once the Baron's body was pulled from the wreckage and his papers examined, there was no doubt as to the identity of the dead flyer. Aside from the entry and exit wounds of the shot that had killed him, the only other damage to von Richthofen's body had been caused when his face had smashed against the butt of his guns upon the impact of the crash. A single bullet had entered the Baron's lower left back and exited his chest slightly higher and to the right. While death must have come quickly to von Richthofen, observers on the scene noted that the Fokker's motor had been switched to the off position, suggesting that the Baron must have known he was in trouble and killed the engine in those last few seconds of his life. As the day wore on, the crash scene was visited by hundreds of soldiers who came to view the remains of the famous Red Baron in his triplane. The Fokker was quickly hacked to pieces as people collected souvenirs from the wreckage, until all that eventually remained of the machine was the metal framework. The Baron himself wasn't spared by the souvenir hunters either. Before a guard could be placed on the body, his helmet, goggles, boots, papers, and even the buttons on his clothing had disappeared. Back at Kappy Airfield, it was not immediately known what had happened to Jagdgeschwader 1's leader. While the pilots of Yasta 11 had been engaged fighting the British Sopwiths, no one had seen the Baron drop away to pursue Wilfred May. At first, there was no cause for undue alarm. It was assumed that von Richthofen had probably landed at another airfield and would soon be home. As the afternoon wore on, with no word from the Rittmeister, the squadron's adjutant, Karl Bodenschatz, got on the telephone and began making inquiries. German observers located on a hilltop across the Somme had witnessed the Baron's last flight, including what appeared to them to be a controlled landing when von Richthofen had come down. This was good news, the German pilots reasoned, harboring the hope that their leader was at least alive, albeit a prisoner of the British. 2 days later, the true facts were revealed, when an English fire dropped a note on the German side stating that the Baron had been killed in combat and subsequently laid to rest with full military honors. A controversy over who had actually killed the Red Baron arose almost immediately. At least 3 men had submitted claims for the deed. The first claim was, of course, by Roy Brown, whose part in the chase had been witnessed by hundreds of soldiers and believed it was his shot that had brought the Baron down. 2 Australian machine gunners each believed that they had scored the fatal shot. Gunner Cedric Popkin had fired some 80 rounds at the triplane when it had passed very near his position shortly before its crash. A second gun, manned by Robert Bowie and W.J. Evans, also got off a shot as the chase had passed over their position. In addition, dozens of small arms had been fired at the red triplane during the course of events. Roy Brown received official credit from the Royal Air Force for downing the Baron, while Cedric Popkin was credited by the Australians. The trajectory of the bullet that passed through the Red Baron's body suggests that it was indeed a shot from the ground that had ended the chase, but the truth will never be known, and the controversy has continued for years.